It was a quiet Tuesday morning in March 2018 when everything changed forever. The sun was just starting to peek through the curtains of a small, well-kept house in suburban Atlanta. Inside, Elena Martinez was making her morning coffee just like she did every day. She was 67 years old, a retired school teacher who loved gardening and spent her weekends volunteering at the local community center. Her son Thomas had called her the night before, as he always did. He was a federal prosecutor working hard in the city, but he never forgot to check on his mother. They had plans to have lunch that weekend, and Elena was looking forward to hearing about his latest cases. Around 9:30 a.m., a police car pulled up outside her house. Officer Michael Barnes, a 12-year veteran of the force, stepped out. He'd been assigned to do a simple wellness check, something that happens hundreds of times a day in cities across America. A neighbor had called because they hadn't seen Eleanor for a few days and were concerned. Barnes walked up to the front door and knocked. When Eleanor opened the door, she was surprised but polite. She explained that she'd been feeling under the weather but was doing better now. She invited the officer in for a cup of coffee, as many people in her friendly neighborhood would do. The house was tidy and smelled like fresh laundry. Family photos lined the walls, pictures of Thomas at his law school graduation, Eleanor with her late husband on their wedding day, grandchildren playing in the backyard. It was a home filled with love and memories. But something went terribly wrong in those next few minutes. The body camera footage, which would later become crucial evidence, captured disturbing comments from Barnes. He made remarks about the neighborhood changing and asked pointed questions about who owned the house. His tone shifted from professional to aggressive without any apparent reason. Eleanor, confused by the sudden change in attitude, asked the officer if everything was all right. She reached for her phone to call her son, thinking maybe there was some misunderstanding. That simple action, a mother reaching for her phone, would be her last. The gunshot rang out at 9:47 a.m. Neighbors heard it and immediately called 911. The sound shattered the peaceful morning and would echo through the community for years to come. When backup arrived, they found Eleanor on her living room floor, her phone still in her hand. Barnes was standing over her, his weapon drawn. The initial radio call reported officer-involved shooting with suspect down. But there was no suspect, just a grandmother who had been making coffee in her own home. The disconnect between the official report and the reality would soon become the center of a storm that would rock the entire justice system. News traveled fast. By noon, Thomas Martinez received the call that would change his life forever. His mother, the woman who had raised him alone after his father passed away, who had worked 2 jobs to put him through law school, was gone, and she had been killed by someone sworn to protect and serve. As the day wore on, more details emerged. The body camera footage showed no weapon, no threat, no reason for lethal force, just an elderly woman in her own home, trying to understand why an officer was treating her with such hostility. The community gathered outside her house, leaving flowers and candles, demanding answers. This wasn't just another tragic incident. This was the moment when everything changed, when a routine wellness check became a murder, when a son lost his mother, and when a community said enough. Little did anyone know that this single morning would lead to one of the most significant legal cases in modern American history. The hours after the shooting were filled with confusion and conflicting stories. The police department quickly released a statement saying the officer had acted in self-defense. They claimed Eleanor had threatened Officer Barnes with a weapon and he had no choice but to protect himself. The official report painted a picture of a dangerous situation that required deadly force. But something didn't add up. The neighbors who had known Eleanor for decades couldn't believe she would ever threaten anyone. She was the kind of person who would bring soup to sick neighbors and babysit for free when young families needed help. The idea of her attacking a police officer seemed impossible. As news vans arrived on the quiet street, more inconsistencies began to surface. The department said they were reviewing body camera footage but claimed there were technical difficulties with the recording. They insisted the investigation would be thorough and transparent, but their actions told a different story. That's when the first breakthrough came. A neighbor across the street had installed new security cameras just weeks before. These cameras had captured the entire incident from a different angle. The footage showed Eleanor standing calmly at her door, no weapon in sight. It showed her confused expression as the officer's demeanor changed, and most importantly, it showed her empty hands as she reached for her phone. When this footage leaked to the media, the department's story began to crumble. Suddenly, parts of the body camera footage that were missing started to appear. Internal sources revealed that supervisors had tried to delete certain segments, but a tech-savvy officer had made backup copies. The complete body camera footage was shocking. It showed Officer Barnes making comments about the neighborhood, questioning whether Eleanor really lived in the house, and becoming increasingly agitated without any provocation. The audio captured Eleanor's gentle voice trying to calm the situation, explaining that her son was a prosecutor and suggesting they could call him to clear up any confusion. Behind the scenes, the police union was working overtime to protect Barnes. They held press conferences suggesting Eleanor had a history of mental health issues, claims that were completely fabricated. They tried to paint Barnes as a dedicated officer under immense stress, but each attempt to muddy the waters only made things worse when the truth came out. Thomas Martinez, despite his grief, knew he had to act. Using his knowledge of the legal system, he began gathering evidence on his own. He discovered that several complaints had been filed against Barnes over the years, complaints about excessive force, racial profiling, and aggressive behavior. Each time, these complaints had been dismissed or buried in paperwork. The turning point came when a young officer named Rodriguez came forward. He had been Barnes' partner 2 years earlier and had witnessed multiple incidents of misconduct. Rodriguez had tried to report these issues but was told to mind his own business or risk his career. Now, seeing what had happened to Eleanor, he couldn't stay silent anymore. Rodriguez revealed that Barnes had a habit of targeting certain neighborhoods during his patrols. He would make unnecessary stops, ask invasive questions, and often escalate situations that could have been handled peacefully. There was a pattern of behavior that the department had ignored for years. Documents began to surface showing how complaints against Barnes had been systematically covered up. Reports were altered, witnesses were pressured to change their statements, and evidence mysteriously disappeared. It became clear that this wasn't just about one bad officer, it was about a system that protected him. As public pressure mounted, the state attorney general stepped in. The local investigation was clearly compromised, and the community had lost all trust in the police department. What started as a local incident was now becoming a national scandal. The police chief held a press conference announcing Barnes had been suspended with pay, calling it standard procedure. But by then, everyone knew this was far from a standard case. The cover-up had failed, and the truth was coming out. The question now wasn't whether Barnes would face justice, but how deep the corruption went and who else would be held accountable. Little did anyone know that this was just the beginning of a legal battle that would change law enforcement practices across the country. The death of Eleanor Martinez would not be in vain. It would become the catalyst for long overdue change. The federal investigation began on a rainy Monday morning, just 3 weeks after Eleanor's death. A team of FBI agents and Department of Justice officials arrived at the police department headquarters with boxes and warrants. This wasn't going to be another internal review that could be swept under the rug. This was serious. The lead investigator, a veteran agent with 25 years of experience in civil rights cases, set up a command center in a nearby federal building. They started by collecting every piece of evidence, not just about Eleanor's case, but about Officer Barnes' entire career. What they found was disturbing. Barnes had been with the department for 12 years, and his personnel file was thick with complaints. There were 23 formal complaints and countless informal ones that never made it to paper. The complaints painted a clear picture. Most involved minority residents, many happened in predominantly non-white neighborhoods, and several mentioned unprovoked aggressive behavior. One case stood out from 5 years earlier. A young college student had been walking home from the library when Barnes stopped him. The student, who was studying to become a doctor, ended up with a broken arm and no charges filed against him. The department had settled the lawsuit quietly, and Barnes returned to duty after a 2-day suspension. The investigators interviewed dozens of officers. Most were reluctant to talk at first, but when promised protection from retaliation, stories began pouring out. They spoke of a culture where certain behaviors were not just tolerated but encouraged. Senior officers would joke about cleaning up certain neighborhoods. Complaints from minority residents were routinely dismissed as playing the race card. Meanwhile, the technical team made a breakthrough with the body camera footage. They discovered that someone had tried to delete specific portions of the recording, but the attempts were amateurish. The deleted segments were recovered, revealing even more troubling behavior from Barnes. He had made several comments about the neighborhood not being what it used to be, and questioned whether Eleanor really belonged in such a nice house. Bank records showed that Barnes had received several large deposits over the years, coinciding with dropped complaints. The money trail led to a legal defense fund that was supposedly for officers facing lawsuits, but seemed to operate more like a slush fund for covering up misconduct. The investigation team also discovered a private social media group where Barnes and several other officers shared offensive content. The posts included racist jokes, derogatory comments about residents in certain neighborhoods, and celebrations when complaints were dismissed. The digital footprint was extensive and damning. Former partners of Barnes began coming forward now that federal protection was in place. They described a man who seemed to enjoy the power his badge gave him. One former partner recalled how Barnes would deliberately patrol certain areas looking for confrontations. Another mentioned how Barnes kept a personal scorecard of arrests in minority neighborhoods. The community response to the federal investigation was mixed. While many were relieved that someone was finally taking the situation seriously, others were skeptical that anything would change. Town hall meetings were packed with residents sharing their own stories of encounters with Barnes and other officers like him. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Eleanor's death was not an isolated incident, but the tragic culmination of years of unchecked behavior. The federal team found evidence of at least 7 other cases where Barnes had used excessive force, but each time, the department had found ways to justify his actions or make the complaints disappear. The turning point came when investigators found a memo from 5 years ago. A supervisor had recommended Barnes be removed from street duty after multiple complaints, noting a pattern of escalation and bias. The memo had been buried, and the supervisor transferred to a desk job shortly after writing it. By the end of the 3-month investigation, the federal team had compiled thousands of pages of evidence. They had interviewed over 200 witnesses, reviewed hundreds of hours of footage, and traced financial records going back a decade. The picture they painted was not just of one bad officer, but of a system that had failed to protect its citizens. The grand jury convened in a federal courthouse, away from local influence. Over 2 weeks, they'd heard testimony from witnesses, reviewed evidence, and deliberated on charges. When they emerged, that decision would send shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the country. Barnes would face federal charges, and several high-ranking officials would be named as co-conspirators in the cover-up. The stage was set for a trial that would put not just Officer Barnes, but the entire system of police accountability on trial. The day the indictment was announced, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, community members, and activists. The federal prosecutor stood at the podium, her voice steady but filled with gravity. Officer Michael Barnes was being charged with federal hate crimes, civil rights violations, and first-degree murder. It was an unprecedented moment in American legal history. The charges were severe, but what shocked everyone was the announcement that the state would seek the death penalty. Never before had a police officer faced capital punishment for actions taken while on duty. The prosecutor explained that the evidence showed this wasn't a split-second decision made under pressure, but a deliberate act fueled by prejudice. Barnes' defense team, paid for by the police union, immediately went on the offensive. They held their own press conference, portraying Barnes as a dedicated officer suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. They claimed he had seen too much violence on the job and had simply made a tragic mistake. They showed photos of Barnes receiving commendations, coaching Little League, and volunteering at community events. But the prosecution had done their homework. They revealed that Barnes had never sought treatment for PTSD, despite the department offering counseling services. His performance reviews showed no signs of stress-related issues. Instead, they painted a picture of an officer who had grown increasingly bold in his misconduct, believing he was untouchable. The indictment detailed a pattern of behavior spanning years. Barnes had specifically targeted certain neighborhoods during his patrols, often making stops without probable cause. The hate crime charges stemmed from evidence showing he had expressed prejudiced views both on and off duty and had acted on these beliefs in his police work. Community reaction was divided. Many felt justice was finally being served, while others worried about the precedent of seeking the death penalty for a police officer. Law enforcement organizations across the country issued statements expressing concern, arguing that officers needed to make split-second decisions and shouldn't face such severe consequences. The legal teams prepared for what would be a landmark trial. The prosecution assembled a team of experts on police procedures, psychology, and civil rights law. They also had Thomas Martinez as a consultant, though he would recuse himself from any direct involvement due to his personal connection to the case. Barnes' defense strategy became clear during pre-trial hearings. They would argue that he suffered from undiagnosed PTSD, that the shooting was a tragic accident, and that seeking the death penalty was politically motivated. They filed motion after motion trying to get evidence excluded, particularly the social media posts and previous complaints. What the defense didn't expect was the parade of former colleagues willing to testify against Barnes. Officers who had remained silent for years were now ready to speak up, protected by federal whistleblower laws. They described a man who seemed to relish confrontation, who made racist jokes in the locker room, and who bragged about teaching certain people a lesson. The judge, known for her fair but firm approach, denied most of the defense motions. She ruled that Barnes' pattern of behavior was relevant to establishing motive and intent. The social media posts would be admitted as evidence of his state of mind. The previous complaints would be allowed to show a pattern of conduct. As jury selection began, the challenges were obvious. Finding impartial jurors in such a high-profile case would be difficult. The process took weeks, with potential jurors questioned extensively about their views on law enforcement, race relations, and the death penalty. Both sides used their challenges carefully, knowing that the jury's composition could determine the outcome. Meanwhile, protests continued outside the courthouse. Supporters of police reform saw this as a watershed moment, while others worried about the implications for law enforcement. The media coverage was intense, with legal experts debating every development on news shows and social media. The prosecution made a strategic decision to charge Barnes under federal hate crime statutes, which carried enhanced penalties. They would need to prove not only that he killed Eleanor Martinez, but that he did so because of her race or ethnicity. This added another layer of complexity to an already challenging case. As the trial date approached, both sides finalized their witness lists. The prosecution planned to call forensic experts, Barnes' former partners, community members who had filed complaints, and experts on police training and procedures. The defense would rely on character witnesses, police procedure experts who would argue Barnes followed training, and psychological experts to support their PTSD claim. The stage was set for a trial that would captivate the nation and potentially reshape how police accountability is handled in America. The question wasn't just whether Barnes would be found guilty, but whether a jury would agree that his actions warranted the ultimate punishment. In the quiet moments before the trial began, Thomas Martinez visited his mother's grave. He promised her that her death would mean something, that it would lead to change. Little did he know how prophetic those words would become. The trial began on a crisp autumn morning, 6 months after Eleanor's death. The courthouse was surrounded by security barriers, with officers checking everyone who entered. Inside, the courtroom was packed with journalists, community members, and legal observers from across the country. This wasn't just another trial, it was a moment that would define justice in America. The prosecution opened with a powerful statement. They described Eleanor Martinez as a beloved teacher, mother, and grandmother who had opened her door that morning expecting to help, not to die. They promised to show the jury not just what happened that day, but why it happened, painting a picture of an officer who had lost sight of his duty to protect and serve. When the defense took their turn, they portrayed Barnes as a dedicated officer overwhelmed by the dangers of his job. They asked the jury to put themselves in his shoes, patrolling dangerous neighborhoods day after day. They suggested that Eleanor's movements had been misinterpreted in a tragic split-second decision that any officer might have made. The first week of testimony focused on the technical evidence. Forensic experts testified that Eleanor had no weapon and was shot from a distance of more than 10 feet. The angle of the bullet showed she was not advancing toward Barnes, but standing still or possibly backing away. The medical examiner confirmed she died almost instantly from a single shot to the chest. Then came the body camera footage. The courtroom fell silent as Elena's last moments played on the screen, her gentle voice asking if everything was all right. Her confusion at Barnes' aggressive questions, the moment she reached for her phone, saying she would call her son to clear things up. And then the gunshot that ended it all. Several jurors wiped away tears. Even the judge seemed moved by what she saw. The defense tried to argue that the video didn't show the full context, but the images were hard to dispute. There was no weapon, no threat, just an elderly woman in her own home. The most dramatic testimony came from Barnes' former partners. Officer Rodriguez took the stand and described multiple incidents where Barnes had shown prejudice towards certain residents. He recalled Barnes saying that some people need to learn their place and describing how Barnes would look for reasons to stop people in certain neighborhoods. Another former partner testified about the scorecard Barnes kept, tracking his arrests by neighborhood and demographic. He described how Barnes would brag about cleaning up the streets and make jokes about people who filed complaints against him. The testimony painted a picture of an officer who saw certain communities as enemies rather than citizens to protect. The prosecution then introduced evidence that shocked even seasoned court observers. They had found a private journal Barnes kept, filled with his thoughts about the job. The entries revealed deep-seated prejudices and a growing sense that he was above the law. One entry, written just weeks before Eleanor's death, talked about teaching these people to respect authority. Social media evidence followed. The prosecution showed posts from Barnes' accounts expressing hostile views towards certain communities. They revealed his membership in online groups where officers shared racist jokes and celebrated when complaints were dismissed. The digital trail was extensive and damning. The defense fought back with their own experts. A psychologist testified that Barnes showed signs of PTSD even if he hadn't sought treatment. They argued that constant exposure to danger had created a hypervigilant state where Barnes saw threats where none existed. They'd brought in other officers who testified about the stress of the job and how it could affect decision-making. Character witnesses spoke about Barnes' volunteer work and community service. They showed photos of him at charity events and coaching youth sports. The defense was trying to humanize him, to show the jury that he wasn't a monster but a flawed human being who made a terrible mistake. But the prosecution's expert on police training delivered devastating testimony. He explained how Barnes had violated multiple protocols that morning. Officers are trained to de-escalate situations, not escalate them. They're taught to keep distance when no immediate threat exists. Every aspect of Barnes' conduct that morning went against standard police training. The emotional peak came when Thomas Martinez testified. Though he had recused himself from the legal team, he was called as a witness to speak about his mother. He described her life of service, her kindness to everyone she met, and her belief in justice and fairness. He told the jury about their last conversation, how she was excited about their upcoming lunch, how she had spent her life helping others. As the trial entered its third week, the weight of evidence seemed overwhelming. The defense's attempts to portray the shooting as a tragic accident fell flat against the mountain of evidence showing Barnes' pattern of prejudiced behavior. The jury had seen not just what happened that morning, but why it happened, and the picture wasn't pretty. During closing arguments, the prosecution reminded the jury that this case was about more than one officer or one victim. It was about whether those sworn to protect and serve would be held accountable when they betrayed that oath. The defense made one final plea for mercy, asking the jury to consider the pressures of police work and the split-second nature of the decision. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, the courtroom held its breath. Whatever they decided would send ripples through law enforcement agencies across the country. The question wasn't just about justice for Eleanor Martinez, it was about what kind of society we wanted to be. The jury deliberated for only 8 hours, far less than anyone expected for such a complex case. When word spread that they had reached a verdict, the courthouse filled quickly. People rushed from nearby offices, community members who had been camping outside hurried in, and news crews scrambled to set up their cameras. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Barnes sat at the defense table, his face pale and drawn. The confident swagger he'd shown throughout his career was gone. His attorneys whispered last-minute reassurances, but their nervous glances betrayed their concern. Across the aisle, the prosecution team sat quietly, their months of preparation coming down to this moment. The judge entered and asked if the jury had reached a verdict. The foreperson, a middle-aged schoolteacher, stood and confirmed they had. As she read the verdict, her voice was steady but emotional. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of federal hate crimes, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of civil rights violations, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted briefly before the judge called for order. Barnes slumped in his chair, his attorneys placing supportive hands on his shoulders. In the gallery, Thomas Martinez closed his eyes and whispered something that might have been a prayer. Community members embraced each other, some crying, others nodding solemnly. But the trial wasn't over. Now came the penalty phase, where the jury would decide whether Barnes should face life in prison or the death penalty. This was uncharted territory. Never before had an American police officer faced possible execution for actions taken while on duty. The prosecution presented aggravating factors, reasons why the death penalty was warranted. They emphasized the abuse of power, the betrayal of public trust, and the vulnerability of the victim. They showed how Barnes had used his badge as a shield for his prejudices, how he had violated the very laws he was sworn to uphold. They brought in impact statements from Eleanor's family, friends, and former students. Each testimony painted a picture of a life cut short and a community left grieving. Her daughter spoke about growing up without a father and now losing her mother to violence. A former student credited Eleanor with helping her escape poverty and become a teacher herself. The defense fought desperately to save Barnes' life. They brought in his elderly parents, who pleaded for mercy. His sister testified about their difficult childhood and how Barnes had always wanted to help people. They presented evidence of his charitable work and argued that life in prison would be sufficient punishment. Psychological experts testified about rehabilitation possibilities and the deterrent effect of life imprisonment versus execution. They argued that making Barnes the first officer executed would create a chilling effect on law enforcement nationwide. Religious leaders spoke about forgiveness and redemption. The jury deliberated for 2 days on the sentence. When they returned, the foreperson's hands trembled as she held the paper. In the matter of sentencing, we the jury recommend the death penalty be imposed. The words fell like hammer blows in the silent courtroom. The judge thanked the jury for their service and set a date for formal sentencing. Before dismissing the court, she addressed Barnes directly. Her words would be quoted in law schools for generations to come. Officer Barnes, you took an oath to protect and serve all citizens equally. Instead, you used your badge as a weapon against those you were sworn to protect. You didn't just take a life that day, you betrayed the trust that makes civil society possible. When those we empower to enforce our laws become the lawbreakers, when protectors become predators, the very foundation of justice crumbles. She continued, this court has heard evidence not just of a momentary lapse in judgment, but of a pattern of bias and abuse spanning years. You had countless opportunities to change course, to honor your oath, to be the officer you pretended to be in public. Instead, you chose hatred over humanity, power over protection, prejudice over justice. The formal sentencing came weeks later. The judge upheld the jury's recommendation, making Barnes the first police officer in modern American history to receive the death penalty. She set an execution date, though everyone knew appeals would delay it for years. Outside the courthouse, reactions were mixed. Civil rights leaders called it a landmark moment for accountability. Police unions warned of dangerous precedent. Legal scholars debated the implications for future cases. But for the Martinez family and their community, it was simply the end of a long journey toward justice. Thomas Martinez spoke briefly to the press. No verdict can bring my mother back, he said, his voice steady despite his obvious emotion. But today sends a message that no one is above the law. My mother believed in justice, in fairness, in the good in people. I hope her death leads to a system where everyone receives the protection and respect she showed to others. As Barnes was led away in shackles, the weight of his sentence visible in his shuffling steps, a chapter in American legal history closed. But the story was far from over. The ripples from this case would spread far beyond one courtroom, one city, one police department. Change was coming, and Eleanor Martinez's death would be the catalyst that sparked it. The years following the verdict saw dramatic changes across American law enforcement. Barnes' legal team filed appeal after appeal, but each was denied. The evidence was too strong, the conduct too egregious, and the precedent too important. As the execution date drew closer, it became clear that this case would indeed make history. The impact of Eleanor Martinez's death rippled far beyond the courtroom. Police departments nationwide began implementing sweeping reforms. Body cameras became mandatory, with strict penalties for tampering with footage. Independent review boards were established to investigate complaints against officers. Training programs were overhauled to emphasize de-escalation and cultural sensitivity. Thomas Martinez channeled his grief into action. He established the Eleanor Martinez Foundation for Justice Reform, dedicated to preventing similar tragedies. The foundation provided legal support to victims of police misconduct, funded community policing initiatives, and offered scholarships to students pursuing careers in law enforcement with a focus on reform. The foundation's first major initiative was the Eleanor Protocol, a set of guidelines for wellness checks that prioritized safety and dignity. The protocol required officers to approach such calls with a mindset of assistance rather than enforcement. It mandated clear communication, respect for personal space, and the presence of mental health professionals when possible. Police academies across the country adopted new curricula. Recruits spent weeks studying the Martinez case, analyzing what went wrong and how it could have been prevented. Veterans officers underwent retraining, learning to recognize and address their own biases. The thin blue line of silence began to crack as officers felt empowered to report misconduct. Communities that had long distrusted law enforcement began to see changes. Town halls brought police and residents together for honest conversations. Officers walked beats instead of staying in patrol cars, getting to know the people they served. Complaint numbers dropped as trust slowly rebuilt. Barnes spent his final years on death row writing letters of apology that were never sent. Prison officials reported that he seemed to genuinely grapple with his actions, though some viewed this as too little, too late. His execution date arrived on a cold November morning, exactly 5 years after Eleanor's death. Outside the prison, protesters gathered on both sides. Some opposed the death penalty on principle, arguing that taking another life wouldn't bring Eleanor back. Others saw it as necessary justice, a clear message that abuse of power would face ultimate consequences. The debate continued long after the sentence was carried out. In the years that followed, the Martinez case became required study in law schools, police academies, and criminal justice programs. It was cited in numerous court decisions and shaped legislation at both state and federal levels. The term Martinez Standard entered legal vocabulary, referring to the heightened scrutiny applied to cases involving abuse of authority. The old police department building in Eleanor's hometown was converted into a community center bearing her name. Inside, photos told her story, the young teacher inspiring students, the mother raising her son alone, the grandmother baking cookies for neighborhood children. A memorial garden outside became a place of reflection and healing. Thomas Martinez eventually returned to his work as a prosecutor, but with a new mission. He specialized in civil rights cases, working to ensure that the justice system served all citizens equally. He often spoke at conferences and training sessions, sharing his mother's story and the lessons learned from her death. "My mother used to say that every person deserves to be seen and heard," he would tell audiences. She lived that belief every day. Her death was a tragedy, but if it leads to a world where everyone receives the dignity and respect she showed to others, then perhaps some good can come from our loss. The neighborhood where Eleanor lived saw a renaissance. Property values rose as people felt safer. Children played in the streets again. The community garden she had started flourished, tended by volunteers who remembered her kindness. A scholarship in her name sent local students to college every year. 20 years later, a documentary about the case won numerous awards. It featured interviews with jurors, officers who had worked with Barnes, and community members whose lives were changed by the verdict. The film ended with footage of Eleanor teaching, her warm smile reminding viewers of the human cost behind the headlines. The case of Officer Barnes and Elena Martinez became more than just a legal precedent. It became a turning point in American history, a moment when the nation confronted uncomfortable truths about power, prejudice, and justice. It proved that no one was above the law and that even the most painful tragedies could spark meaningful change. As Thomas Martinez said at the 20th anniversary memorial service, standing in the garden his mother had loved, justice isn't just about punishment. It's about creating a world where what happened to my mother never happens again. Every officer who chooses de-escalation over force, every department that holds its members accountable, every community that builds trust instead of fear, that's my mother's legacy. That's what makes her death mean something.